The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and quiet money. Elara sat in the corner chair, the one farthest from the window, the one nobody wanted, pressing her hands flat against her thighs to stop them from trembling. Around the mahogany table sat people she had grown up calling family. Cousins who never called. An uncle who smelled like expensive cologne and cheaper intentions. Her father's second wife, Margaret, draped in a black dress that probably cost more than Elara's monthly rent. They were all waiting for the same thing. The lawyer, a thin man named Gerald Foss who wore glasses too large for his face, opened a manila envelope with the quiet ceremony of someone who had done this 1,000 times and still enjoyed the theater of it. He read. Numbers floated across the room. The house in Connecticut. The investment portfolio. The beach property in the Carolinas. Each announcement was followed by a small, satisfied exhale from someone at the table. And then Gerald Foss cleared his throat, adjusted his oversized glasses, and said her name. To my daughter, Elara Voss, I leave $1. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Margaret laughed. Not a cruel laugh, something worse. A polite one. The kind designed to humiliate without leaving fingerprints. Her cousin Derek didn't even try to hide it. $1, he repeated, shaking his head slowly, like he was watching a car accident. That's something. Elara didn't cry. She sat very still, the way she had learned to sit still as a child in that house, invisible, enduring, waiting for the room to forget about her. She folded her hands in her lap. $1. She didn't know yet that it was the most valuable thing in the room. Her father had been sick for 2 years before he died, and for those 2 years, Elara had done what she always did, she showed up. She drove 4 hours every other weekend from her apartment in Philadelphia to the house in Westfield. She sat beside his bed when the medication made him drift. She learned the names of his nurses, brought him the specific brand of ginger tea he liked. And read aloud from old National Geographic magazines because he said the sound of her voice made the pain quieter. Margaret tolerated her presence the way you tolerate a drafty window, acknowledging it without fixing it. Nobody in the family had ever fully accepted Elara. She was Robert Voss's daughter from his first marriage, the marriage that ended before the money really came, before the Connecticut house and the portfolio and the beach property. She was a reminder of a version of Robert Voss that his second family preferred not to think about. She worked as a freelance graphic designer. Not glamorously, she designed logos for small businesses, social media graphics for local restaurants, occasional wedding invitations. She made enough. Barely. She lived in a 2-room apartment where the radiator clicked all winter and the upstairs neighbor apparently owned tap shoes and practiced at midnight. She wasn't poor. But she wasn't safe, either. There's a specific kind of financial anxiety that doesn't leave marks on the outside. You look fine, you seem fine, but you calculate every grocery purchase. You know exactly how many days you can survive if a client doesn't pay on time. After the will reading, she drove home on the interstate in silence. No music. No podcasts. Just the sound of the road and her own breathing. She had not expected much. She had told herself she expected nothing. But there is a difference between expecting nothing and receiving proof that you mattered so little, that after 2 years of quiet devotion, of ginger tea and National Geographic magazines and 4-hour drives, your father had looked at his life and placed a single dollar beside your name. She cried somewhere around exit 34. Just for a few minutes. Then she stopped, wiped her face with the sleeve of her black dress, and drove the rest of the way home. The apartment was cold. The radiator was doing its thing. She set the crisp, folded $1 bill on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. She had no idea what to do with it. Spend it felt wrong. Throw it away felt worse. She left it there and went to bed. The next morning arrived gray and slow. Elara made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, trying to answer emails with the particular performance of normalcy that grief demands. A client needed revisions on a bakery logo. Another wanted a color change on a wedding menu. She typed responses she wouldn't remember typing. At 9:47 a.m., her buzzer rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. The man at the door was perhaps 65, with silver hair combed neatly back and the kind of posture that came from decades of deliberate discipline. He wore a plain dark coat and carried a leather briefcase that wasn't new but was very well maintained, the kind of object that had been cared for. He said his name was Thomas Albright. He said he worked for her father. My father's estate has already been distributed, Elara said carefully. Not all of it. He looked at her steadily. May I come in? She considered him. She was a woman alone in an apartment and a stranger was at her door. But there was something about him, not warmth exactly, more like weight. The quality of someone who had been trusted with serious things for a long time. She stepped back and let him in. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where the $1 bill still lay, and he opened his briefcase. Inside were documents. A photograph. A small brass key on a plain ring. Your father, Thomas Albright said, maintained a second estate. It has been in trust for 22 years. It cannot be claimed by any member of his current family. It can only be claimed by his first child, by blood, by name, and by one specific condition. Elara stared at him. What condition? He nodded at the dollar bill on the table. That she still has this. The silence in the apartment was different from the silence in the lawyer's office. That one had been cruel. This one was enormous. The dollar was the key, Thomas said simply. Your father was a complicated man. He tested people throughout his life. He wanted to know, not whether you were loyal. Not whether you were patient, but whether you would hold on to something that looked worthless when everyone around you was receiving things that looked valuable. He paused. You kept it. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it, Elara said honestly. Something in the old man's expression shifted, almost a smile. He said you'd say something like that. She looked at the photograph he placed on the table. A house, not a house, a property, set behind old trees, with a stone facade and wide windows that caught the light in a way that made it look like it was glowing from within. He called it the Meridian House, Thomas said. He bought it before he married Margaret. Before most of the money, actually. He bought it for your mother. A pause. And then everything became complicated. Elara's mother had died when she was 7. A car accident on a winter road. He never sold it, Thomas continued. He never lived in it again after she died. He kept it maintained, kept it quiet, kept it separate. And he decided, 22 years ago, that if you grew up to be the kind of person who didn't discard what seemed worthless, it belonged to you. Elara's hands were flat on the table again. Same position as yesterday. But different. I need to show you something, Thomas said. I'd like to take you there today, if you're willing. She looked at the brass key on its plain ring. She looked at the photograph of the glowing stone house behind old trees. She thought about the radiator that clicked all winter. She thought about 4-hour drives and ginger tea and a lifetime of being the person in the corner chair. Let me get my coat, she said. The drive took nearly 3 hours, northeast, into a part of Connecticut she had never visited. Along roads that grew progressively narrower and older until the trees pressed close on either side like a corridor nature had built for exactly this purpose. Thomas drove. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. When he did speak, it was factual. The property was 42 acres, the main house had 7 bedrooms, there was a guest cottage near the east tree line. The groundskeeper had been maintaining it for 17 years. 17 years, she said. Your father continued paying him throughout. She turned this over in her mind. Her father, who had sat across from her at Christmas dinners with the careful politeness of a man managing a wound. Her father, who had never once said the things she needed him to say. Who had watched her grow up at a distance, separated by Margaret's subtle architecture of exclusion. Who had left her $1 in front of people who laughed. That same man had been paying a groundskeeper for 17 years on a property he kept hidden, ready for her. People, she thought, are not single stories. The house, when she first saw it, did not disappoint the photograph. If anything, the photograph had been modest. The stone facade was dark gray and green with age, not neglect, age, which is different, and the trees were enormous, the kind that took generations to grow. Their roots visible above the ground like old hands gripping the earth. The windows were tall and clean. She stood in the gravel drive and felt something she didn't have a word for yet. Thomas gave her the tour. Room after room, high ceilings, original wood floors, furniture covered in white sheets like sleeping figures. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, most of them still full. A kitchen with a stone hearth that had been converted to gas at some point but still held the shape of something very old. A staircase with a slight creak on the fourth step. In one of the upstairs rooms, a smaller one at the end of the hall, with a window that looked east over the property, she found something that stopped her entirely. A child's drawing, framed on the wall. Crude, obviously old, obviously made by young hands, a house, some trees, a yellow circle for sun, and two stick figures. Beneath them, in the unsteady handwriting of a child, the words, "Me and Mama." She recognized the handwriting. She recognized it because she had seen old birthday cards saved in her grandmother's house. She had written that. She had been, maybe, 5 years old. Her father had framed it. He had kept it in this house for decades. She sat on the floor of that room for a long time. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. They were complicated and often exhausting in ways she hadn't expected. The property was hers legally, but establishing that took time. There were document reviews, verification processes, meetings with estate attorneys who asked her the same questions in slightly different orders. The family found out, Derek through some channel she never identified, and there were phone calls. Messages. Margaret wrote her a letter that managed to be simultaneously accusatory and pitying, which was an impressive accomplishment in cruelty. She didn't respond to any of them. But she also had to confront the practical reality. She owned a 42-acre property with a 7-bedroom house and a guest cottage that she couldn't afford to run on a freelance graphic designer's income. The property taxes alone were a number she had to read twice before it settled. There was no cash inheritance. No portfolio. Just the house and the land and a small trust that covered maintenance costs for another 3 years. She drove back to Philadelphia, sat in her clicking radiator apartment, and tried to figure out what came next. The obvious answer was to sell. A property like that, the location, the size, the character, would sell for an amount that would change her life financially in the most straightforward way possible. She could be done with it. Take the money. Be safe in a way she had never been safe before. She sat with that option for 2 weeks. She drew up lists. Pros and cons, financials, timelines. She was practical by nature, you had to be, living the way she had lived. But every time she got close to deciding to sell, she thought about the drawing on the wall in the east room. The tiny handwriting. Me and Mama. She thought about her father paying a groundskeeper for 17 years because he couldn't bring himself to let it go. She thought about the quality of the light through those tall windows. She made a different decision. It was terrifying in the specific way that right decisions often are. She didn't quit freelance design. She couldn't afford to yet. But she began spending weekends at the Meridian house, staying in one of the smaller bedrooms she'd gotten functional before the others, learning the property the way you learn a language, slowly. with mistakes, gradually finding fluency. The groundskeeper's name was Harold. He was in his mid-50s, quiet and methodical, with calloused hands and a deep knowledge of the land's personality, which areas flooded in spring, which trees were old enough to need monitoring, where the soil was richest. He had worked the property for 17 years without ever meeting the owner who paid him, and he treated Elara's arrival with a kind of careful respect she found deeply moving. "Your father sent letters sometimes," Harold told her one afternoon while they were walking the east field. "Not often. But sometimes. Just checking in. Asking how the trees were." She stored that information carefully, the way you store something fragile. The turning point didn't come in a single moment. It accumulated. It happened through months of weekends spent gradually uncovering what the property actually was. The library, she started cataloging it and discovered her father had been collecting first editions, some quite valuable, apparently not as an investment but simply because he liked them. The East Field, Harold told her the soil was exceptional, that the previous owner before her father had used it for a market garden, that it had good drainage and enough sun. She had studied design but she had always been drawn to the intersection of aesthetics and function, the way beautiful things could also be useful things. Working at a desk in Philadelphia, that instinct had found only narrow expression. Here, it found open land. The specific turning point was a morning in early April, 6 months after she first walked through the house's front door. She was in the library, cataloging, when she found a journal tucked behind a row of books on the second shelf. Her father's handwriting on the cover, just the year, 1997, 2 years before she was born. She almost didn't read it. It felt like trespass. She read it anyway. It was not what she expected. There was no grand confession, no dramatic accounting of regrets. It was a journal of plans. Her father in 1997 had been a dreamer she had never seen, writing about what he wanted to build at the Meridian property, the kind of place it could become. A working estate. A place that combined beauty and purpose, where the land was used meaningfully and the house was full of people who were making real things. He had written, "I want Elara to have something that asks something of her. Not money. Money asks nothing of you. I want her to have a place that needs her." She read that sentence 4 times. A place that needs her. She had spent her whole life being the person who needed things, needed acceptance, needed financial stability, needed acknowledgement. She had organized her entire interior life around what she lacked. And her father, imperfect, distant, complicated, silent, had looked at her from whatever impossible angle parents sometimes see their children. And understood something about her that she hadn't understood about herself. She needed to be needed. She put the journal down. She walked outside. The April light was doing extraordinary things to the field. She called Harold over and said, "Tell me everything you know about this soil." The transformation of Meridian House was not fast and it was not clean and it was not, for a long time, financially sound. She started with the library, properly catalogued, with several significant first editions sold through a reputable dealer. That money went into the East Field. Harold knew a retired agricultural extension officer named Patience who came and assessed the land with the thoroughness of a scientist and the enthusiasm of someone given an unexpected gift. The soil was, as Harold had suggested, exceptional. The first growing season was humbling. Elara had no background in agriculture. She had no background in estate management, historic property maintenance, or running any kind of enterprise larger than her own freelance operation. She made mistakes that cost money. She hired a contractor who did substandard work on the cottage renovation. She overcommit to a market garden output she couldn't deliver that first year. She kept going. The freelance work continued. She had gotten faster and more efficient at it over the years, which meant she could earn the same income in fewer hours, which meant she had more time for Meridian. She gave herself a 5-year horizon. 5 years to make it viable. By the end of the second year, the cottage was properly renovated and she began renting it as an extended-stay creative residency, a place for writers, artists, and designers to come for weeks at a time and work in the particular quality of quiet that the property offered. It filled faster than she expected. Word spread the way word spreads among people who are desperate for real silence and real space, quickly, and with genuine gratitude. By the third year, the Eastfield Market Garden was producing enough to supply 3 local restaurants who paid fairly and were proud to tell their customers about Meridian's vegetables. Harold had brought in a young woman named Danny who knew about herb cultivation and began developing a small dried herb operation that Elara eventually integrated into an online shop. The financial picture was still tight in year 3. Not comfortable, but sustainable. But the deeper transformation was internal, and that one had no tidy timeline. Elara had always been someone who waited. Waited to be acknowledged. Waited to be included. Waited for someone in her family to say the thing she needed to hear. She had organized her emotional life around absence, around what wasn't given. Running Meridian required her to be completely present. The land didn't care about her wounds. Harold didn't need her to process her grief out loud. The cottage guests needed functional things, clean spaces, reliable internet, good water pressure. The restaurant buyers needed consistent quality on a consistent schedule. There was something, she found, deeply freeing about being needed in concrete ways by things that couldn't see her pain. She still had therapy. She still had nights when the grief, for her mother, for her father, for the version of her childhood she hadn't had, arrived uninvited and sat beside her like an old house guest. She didn't fight it anymore. She let it sit. She made it coffee, metaphorically. She acknowledged it existed and then she got up the next morning and went out to the field. She stopped waiting to hear from the other Voss family. Not with bitterness, that would have required ongoing energy she needed elsewhere. She simply redirected her attention to the people and places that were actually present in her life. Derek called once, 18 months in. He was friendly in the way people are friendly when they want something. He suggested they should reconnect. She thanked him for calling and said she was very busy and hung up without making plans. Margaret sent a second letter. Elara read it, recognized it as another performance, and filed it without responding. These were not victories, exactly. They were the quiet choices of a person who had decided to stop organizing her life around other people's recognition of her value. In her 4th year at Meridian, while converting one of the unused upper-floor rooms into a proper studio space, she found a second hidden compartment. It wasn't dramatic, not a secret passage or a locked safe. Harold, who had been helping her move furniture, noticed that the back panel of a built-in wardrobe didn't quite match the wall depth it should have. They investigated carefully and found a shallow space behind it containing a wooden box, small enough to hold in both hands. Inside the box were 3 items. The first was a photograph. Her mother, young, much younger than Elara could ever remember seeing her, standing in the east field of Meridian in what must have been late summer. She was looking at the camera with an expression that wasn't quite a smile but was something better, the look of someone who is exactly where they want to be. The second item was a deed. The original deed for the Meridian property, dated 1994. Purchased in both names, Robert Voss and Anna Voss. Her mother's name was on the deed. The house had been as much her mother's as her father's. Which meant, technically and symbolically, that Elara had inherited it from both of them. The third item was a letter. Not long. 1 page, front side only, written in her father's hand but clearly written much later than the journal. The handwriting was shakier, more careful, the way it had been in his last years. She took the letter to the east room, the small one with the window that looked over the property, where the framed drawing still hung. She sat on the floor, the same way she had sat on the floor the first time she came here, and she read it. He had written, "Elara, I have not been the father you deserved. I have no excuse good enough for that and I won't insult you by trying to construct one. What I know is this: you have your mother's instinct for what is real. She could walk into a room full of valuable things and go directly to the thing with actual worth. Not monetary worth. The other kind. I built a test because I was afraid to simply give. I am sorry for that. A better man would have just called you and said, "Come, this is yours, I love you, I'm sorry." I am not that man. But this house, yours and hers, is what I am able to say instead. The dollar was never a test of your character. I knew your character. It was a test of mine, to see if, even at the end, I could find one small right thing to do. I hope the field is beautiful. Your mother said it was the best field in Connecticut. Dad, she sat with that letter for a very long time. Harold, eventually, came to the door of the room, saw her face, and left quietly to make tea, not asking, just doing it. The way people do when they have spent enough time with someone to know what is needed. She stayed on the floor until the light through the east window moved all the way across the room. She understood something, sitting there, something she hadn't fully understood before. She had spent years framing her story as one of exclusion. Being left out, left behind, received less than. And those things were true. They had happened. The pain of them was real and she didn't need to minimize it. But sitting on the floor with her mother's photograph and her father's imperfect, late, insufficient, genuine letter, she understood that she had also been loved in the only language her father knew how to speak, which was the language of place and provision and quiet, private acts of preservation. He had preserved her mother's field. He had preserved her childhood drawing. He had kept a groundskeeper for 17 years so that when she finally came, there would be someone who knew the land to help her learn it. It wasn't the love she had needed. But it was real. And the work she had been doing for 4 years, the field and the cottage and the herb operation and the silent rooms where writers came to make real things, that was real too. She had not received a story that was whole. She had received fragments. A dollar. A key. A letter. A field. She had made a life out of them anyway. Meridian House today is not famous. It doesn't need to be. The East Field produces through summer and into fall. The cottage is booked months in advance by people who tell Elara, when they leave, that they did the best work of their lives in the particular quiet of that property. Harold's daughter Dani has expanded the herb operation into something real. A local school has started bringing students to the field once a year to understand where food comes from. Elara lives in the house, not in solitude, but in that particular fullness that comes from building something that asks something of you daily. She has the dollar. It's framed now, in a simple frame, hung in the kitchen where the stone hearth still holds the shape of something very old. Guests sometimes ask about it and she tells them a version of the story, not all of it, because some stories are yours to keep, and they tend to nod slowly. The way people nod when they recognize something true. She doesn't spend much time thinking about Derek or Margaret or the rooms full of valuable things she was excluded from. But she thinks sometimes about what her father wrote, "I knew your character. It was a test of mine," and she turns it over like a smooth stone, examining it from different angles. Because the real inheritance wasn't the property. It wasn't even the love, imperfect and belated as it was. The real inheritance was this: a demonstration that the things which look worthless in a room full of laughing people, patience, presence, the ability to hold on to what others discard, are sometimes exactly the things that open the doors everyone else walks past. She holds on to that. She holds on to a lot of things now. Not out of fear, not out of grief, but because she has learned, slowly. From a field and a groundskeeper and a one-page letter and a child's drawing on an east-facing wall, that some things are worth the holding. People will always have opinions about what you deserve. They will look at what you've been given and draw conclusions about your worth. But inheritance is not only what arrives in envelopes at polished mahogany tables. It is also what you carry inside you, the instincts, the endurance, the quiet refusal to discard what seems worthless. The question worth sitting with is this: if someone handed you something that looked like nothing, something easy to throw away, something everyone around you would laugh at, would you keep it long enough to find out what it really was? Sometimes the door to everything is the size of a dollar bill. And sometimes the people who laugh loudest are standing in rooms they will never truly own.